Welcome to the CG Pro podcast. This is episode 36. We have Kathryn Brillhart with us today. Kathryn is an amazing virtual production supervisor coming from cinematography, and she's worked on some incredible projects like Black Adam and Suicide Squad and Top Gun, Maverick, and it's a great pleasure to have Kathryn here today. Kathryn, welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, me too. Me too. Yeah, so to start with, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you got into filmmaking in the first place. Like, were there particularly any kind of early inspirations that you things you saw when you were a kid that made you interested in film? Like, how did this kind of all start for you?
Oh yeah, definitely. Growing up, my dad was a cinematographer and owned his own production company. So I had cameras in my hand growing up all the time, and to me, it was just sort of second nature to be expressing myself that way, and it became a passion of mine, and that was the art form that I used to express myself the most. And he was more in documentary or kind of corporate videos. So for him, his career took him all around the world. And so as a kid, I just saw cinematography as a way to see the world and to see, light and people. And um, I don't know, that's sort of where the original passion came from.
Oh, cool. So from your father's inspiration, that's amazing. And did that encourage you to kind of experiment when you were a kid and make your own films?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like I remember when I was growing up, their visual effects were already kind of at the very beginning of this early like CG sort of boom and revolution. So I just remember shooting as a kid and thinking, what are the missing pieces here? How do I get all these other elements that these big filmmakers have in the camera? Like, how are they shooting this? And so even as a kid at home, having digital, handy cams and things, I was playing with stop motion animation, and just it was cool to have a digital camera and be learning that way instead of learning on film first, because you could just have hours of tape, and
Yeah.
put a shutter and what is light if you do this? What happens if you use a rotopolar? And I'll never forget my dad going like, "It looks cool on a sunny day, but wait for it to rain and then see what it does to the raindrops on the cars." And I was just like enamored by filtration and like all these different elements of photography. So
Yeah, we had somebody on a recent podcast, Peter Higuchi, was talking about his start in film and saying it was with film and he had to save up for a long time to buy a minute's worth of film. So yeah, definitely really interesting that you had that ability to experiment a lot and try things a
yeah,
lot.
well, it was weird because so there was this stigma at the time, that digital was just broadcast and it was this nothing sort of medium. And that, if you wanted to be a real artist or like a real filmmaker, you had to learn how to use film. And it was true at the time because, the red cameras didn't come out and revolutionize or democratize digital cinema until 2008. So I guess as a kid, I was just like, I'm going to go to film school and like learn like a real filmmaker's medium. So by the time I went to film school, it was really hard to find a school that had film as something that was being taught. And I was lucky enough to find like Ithaca College. And what I liked about their program is that they were super story driven. They wanted to, you know, have they created people who could think about philosophy and ideas and, the stories of like why and the process behind filmmaking. And they didn't want to own your work as a filmmaker. And they just had a bunch of Bolexes for everybody and some A10 LTRs if you were a senior, and you could really mess around and play. And so it was interesting to be in a film school where most people that I was learning with had never touched a digital camera or a film camera. They just had a still photography camera. And I didn't realize until I went to school how unique my experience was. Like having had an entire lifetime in digital photography, and then trying to reverse apply that to film, and then coming back out into the film industry and having the film industry transition into digital. So it's just kind of a weird, like forward, backward experience going between digital to film for me, or both.
What did you learn from having to use film, having already used digital? What did that kind of teach you?
It taught me why all of these controls and buttons were on the camera. I
Mm.
got to see mechanically what a shutter was. I got to be in a dark room and understand why Photoshop had a burn tool,
Mm.
or um, little things like that, where I understood more tactily why cinematographers would do wedge tests or camera tests, because um, sometimes the only way to really know what the look would be to test it out first on little strips of film, and come to the director and share those tests. So it was just really interesting to see where some of the traditions and language was coming from. And yeah, like it's weird because I think editing and post production and color are all kind of part of that same conversation. Um, but it was interesting. It's always been interesting to me to see how, um, if this DP is using filtration, you can substitute that with color, with the colorist. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, they're just, when you start understanding how many different types of processes there are, it gets exciting as a filmmaker, because you realize that all these different recipes for how you work affect the final product. So
Right. Yeah, it's interesting seeing where why things are called what they're called. The fact that it's come from a process that's dead now, that doesn't really exist anymore, but it's being simulated in digital just because everyone's so used to it, and the fact that it's then sticks in an environment where it sometimes isn't necessary, but it does introduce a technique or a look or an aesthetic that people like, and we're kind of always trying to, I feel like in digital, trying to get back to that look that we got with film, with all the imperfections that came with that process, and we're trying to get them back and put them into the digital process.
oh yeah, totally. I mean, it's a medium. It's like, visually, when I try to describe it, it's like looking at crayon versus watercolor versus colored pencil versus oil paint. Like, these are all just different textures, that you're applying with those mediums. And something that people don't think about either really are how film and digital, like the equipment and the tools that you use, affect the teamwork and the process for how you're working. So it's been fascinating, to get to kind of go through digital cinematography, film, exploring post-visual effects, diving into VR and virtual production, and then still see how, directors and artists who want to continue to use filmmaking with some, virtual production techniques such as like LED wall workflows. It's fascinating to see how you're combining three different types of, professional workflows in that one scenario. But it's good to have had the experience with all of them, because you can take things that are important in that work and then guide others to leave those other things that don't work behind.
Right. Yeah, this moment in time represents, as you said, a collision of multiple disciplines and industries, and I know that's the it's necessary as a virtual production supervisor to have been through all of those, to have been through visual effects, to have been through filmmaking, cinematography, um, and virtual production, the new parts of that and the old parts of that, because it's kind of an addition to a visual effects supervisor, because there's another layer on top of that, which was the combination of those industries previously.
Yeah, definitely. Um, it's exciting that there is room in the, I guess, the head of department circle for a new role. And I think one of the unique things about this new role is that it's influenced by um, uh, the past, and that there's definitely a department that exists for those kind of workflows, depending on how they scale. Um, but it's interesting. I guess what I'm trying to get to is that um, for so long, for like almost 30 or 40 years, where visual effects supervisors have had to carry this like burden and do the extra labor of, um, like kind of supporting other department heads as they prep to kind of teach them about their workflows and like that they are an equal in that creative process. And it's been quite a journey to see like visual effects supervisors even earn that equal status and collaboration over the years. So as like a newcomer head of department, even in that circle, what's fascinating is that a virtual production supervisor is simultaneously helping a few different departments prep. So you're like in service to, you're supporting other departments because a lot of your team and your artists and the workflows that you're managing are in support of art department and supporting the DP prepping and their gaffer prepping and their whoever's managing the department prepping. And then you're also working with visual effects to make sure that all of your workflows make sense with how they would like to work on set and have the in-camera visual effects flow downstream to their teams if there's going to be any kind of pipeline work. And then, at the end of the day, you're still, in addition to that, reporting to the director. They're your boss essentially, and you're making sure that their vision is whole with the technology and the processes that you're bringing to set when you work. So, I guess if you thought visual effects supervising was difficult or DPing was difficult, VP supervising brings a whole different level of complexity to that.
Right, and it's very important. Without it, you a bunch of departments that can do their piece, but not understand how it comes together. So, yeah, it's really cool to talk about it because it's a conversation that doesn't get had all that often, I think. What you talked a little bit already about what a virtual production supervisor is. How would you say you become one, or what was your route to becoming one?
Well, I think it helps. I think it definitely helped that as a cinematographer, I've always worked into taking leadership roles. And so I know what it takes to be a department head. I know what that means on set, and I know what that means to prep, and I know how to work with the director and get to know multiple directors. And I think the benefit of working in post-visual effects was definitely having a much deeper understanding of the post pipeline and all of the groups that touch the image after production is finished. And I think that being able to see that scope when I'm planning a workflow helped me pivot into virtual production supervision because I can communicate with the heads of departments that really need to have a path cleared for them to do their best artwork. And I would say, I guess it's just sort of understanding the technology. I understand like the onset technology and where the shots are going. And I can also kind of communicate with a visual effects supervisor and really understand what they're saying when they talk about how they like to collect elements on set during that part of the process and how they would like them organized and tracked to get to the next phase. And I think visual effects coordinating really helped prepare me for that. So
Right, getting to see the insides of the visual effects process, you get to understand what it takes to do that, how what you do on set really affects that process, and that's something which has always been a passion of mine, trying to get being in the visual effects side most of my career, wanting to get good results from a film set, and sometimes being able to influence that, but sometimes not, and just having to deal with what you got given. That really helps. I was wanted to have more presence on set from people on set sometimes have, I know, challenging for them to have other people that affect their workflow on set and tell them to stop because we've got to do something else. Like, how do you how has that been for you in terms of being able to be on a set and then be able to have a lot of influence in such a dynamic environment?
Um, well, I think every setting is different. Every group of people that you work with is different. So the personalities, the way the project is set up, um, from a budget standpoint, or just the logistics of how a set is run, can impact all of that. So I think it's important to kind of do your best to, I feel like, being a very proactive listener, really
Mm.
understanding what people need, being able to anticipate, getting to know somebody as deeply as you can, as quickly as you can, so you can anticipate their needs. Because the way I'd like to work is to make sure that people see me as a collaborator who's kind of helping remove obstacles and working with my team to remove as many creative obstacles as we can.
Right.
Um, and
So
sorry.
what kind of, when do you get involved typically in the process? Do you are you there from the very beginning, from the beginning of pre-production? When's the kind of the right time for a virtual production supervisor to start getting involved in the production?
Well, ideally, especially if you're planning to have a client-side, virtual production supervisor, um, it would be during the very early like bidding process, the same as a visual effects supervisor. That way, you can all kind of work together, um, because uh, everybody's budget is affected by all the choices that are made from that point forward. And it's been very challenging having been pulled onto projects that um, we're already 9 months into a conversation around virtual production, that, you end up, I've been on those projects, and sometimes you can't dig the production out of the hole or like rabbit hole that they've gone down fast enough for them to stay on track with the project. So it'd be nice to be on when you're in the bidding phase. That way, if there's a custom build or like custom workflow that we'd want to do, whether it's motion capture, visualization integration into a workflow, um, you know, live composite, like depth compositing or LED screen and camera visual effects, we're kind of all prepping toward that goal. Then it gives me the ability to build a team, whether it's individuals or a robust team of different vendors that makes sense to take on certain parts of the project. Audition those vendors, and then I feel like once you start executing that, assuming you're in an LED workflow, or as soon as you start kind of triggering hires and payment for artists on the project toward a creative goal, that's already pretty late in the process as far as work. Because I would say virtual production department is sort of in production as soon as any artists are hired and are working. So it might be a couple months or weeks prep for myself and a producer getting ourselves organized around what the goal of the project is, and then pulling the artists together. But once that team's working, virtual production's in production, and we're supporting the production, and we're making sure that we're clearing the path for everyone. So that's something also to consider, that those artists are already kind of working and being pulled in.
Right. Yeah. No, that's still, I know that there's been a lot of education around this subject already, around like people saying things like virtual production is production, and
Mm-hmm.
fix it in pre, and these kinds of things, where we're hinting at the fact that a lot of this work is being done before the shoot, or almost all of it in the case of LED, even though we know sometimes things are being still done in post after that. I think still people feel like it's a visual effects department and it's post.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting how that's still a perception, I think, of it. Um, is there anything that you would say to like people considering taking on a virtual production project, particularly a producer that's thinking of all the different ways that they could accomplish a project, all the different ways they could do it the way we've always done it before, do it practically, do it with visual effects, have a go at virtual production. I feel like there's some trepidation out there from people having done things a certain way traditionally. It's something that's and visual effects is still a fairly new industry effectively, but there is a sense that this is how it's done with visual effects. But now we're coming and saying, okay, here's another tool we're adding into the process. There can be some fear around new things, I think, for producers. Do you have any thoughts on how to approach that? Say you were a producer and you're thinking about doing this. How would you go about it?
Yeah, I mean, I always ask these questions up front. What problem are we trying to solve by applying this technology? Is it to enhance the creative vision? Is it just to solve a logistics problem? I think recently there's been like a lot of really important marketing around some of the positive sides of certain virtual production techniques where you can bring a location to you if you need to, if there's like a pandemic or a reason that you can't travel crew. Those are certainly positive. In my own experimentation using LED wall workflows and certain techniques on my own, there have been benefits to avoiding night shoots, just many logistical things like that. So maybe one of the first places to start with any of these techniques are, what logistics can these techniques simplify on the shoot? What creative challenges can we solve? If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, I think it's a tool. I think with every new innovation, people have this tendency to think like, okay, we're gonna use this to do everything from now on. I saw that with VR, where
Yeah.
VR came about, and we're all going to be looking at Windows desktop in VR, and people tried that, and most people didn't really want to do everything in VR. Do a little bit in VR, yes, and it still exists, but there's this kind of big wave of hype at the beginning of something, and then it kind of settles into how it's practically useful for people's workflows. And I think it's really good to hear you say to talk about that approach, to think about it from a what are we trying to accomplish first of all. And
Yeah.
then I used to have this conversation a lot in visual effects, like, okay, this is what you want to do. And I would often get in trouble in meetings about it because I was in the CG department, and I would be there talking people out of CG and saying, you should do it practically because that would probably be better. And
Yeah.
in this case, you're saying the same thing, like, let's take it back to first principles. What's the challenge we're trying to solve?
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of people have this perception as well of virtual production, that its purpose is to save money, and I know that it has more usefulness than that. It can actually enable you to do other things that aren't possible in other ways. But there is that perception that it's supposed to be for saving you money on your budget. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's definitely not a silver bullet.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to kind of recognize just the history of where some of these techniques came from, too. I mean, motion capture has been developed inside the visual effects community and been applied by amazing supervisors like Dan Lemon on Planet of the Apes and earlier, but those were big films that kind of drove innovation in those areas further. And visualization, visualization kind of came out of computer graphics meets animation for larger directors who wanted to be able to see, they wanted to be able to make their film before they made their film. Like a lot of these techniques came out of visual effects adjacent teams or visual effects teams that needed to innovate to keep up with a director wanting to solve really specific creative problems, because they were directors that had a budget big enough that they could decide or have more agency in what process they were using. Probably as artists, that's kind of an homage to just any art form, or any style of making art is, taking tools and techniques that anybody could use and then doing something really different with them. And so the moment that we're in right now with virtual production is more of a consumer prosumer boom, if that makes sense. So even though it's still expensive and sort of out of the reach of most people's reach, there has been enough development for larger directors and studios with bigger budgets that there's kind of more of a market now for more people to try these techniques. And I think that even if you were to try to relate this back to the DSLR movement, or the digital revolution in 2008, where more the cinematographers flooded the market because everyone could buy a camera and have an editing system. And Unreal Engine's doing something similar now with their game engine, but the democratization in virtual production is really more, it seems to be more in a space for students and independent filmmakers who are interested in making animated films that have physical elements incorporated into them. So 2022, we're now in December, if you, there are all these ifs, but if you can afford a computer that has a certain graphics card, you can download the engine for free and incorporate, it's kind of feels like it's democratized visual effects for the cinematographer. I'm excited because as a DP who's always wanted to work at Pixar or something, I can take up an iPad on my Red Rock rig, hook it into Unreal Engine with maybe a team of international artists that I'm working with on a project, and I can be shooting something that they're animating. And it's just a totally different way of collaborating. So I think in that respect, it's sort of democratized, but I guess all that to say, if there's so many people that go through film production, and whether it's college or just the school of life in production, and they've never intersect with visual effects, and I think that's totally nuts. But my experience has been I've had to pull visual effects into my life because I can see a bigger picture for how the most innovative directors and cinematographers that I know use that and decide to talk about it or not. And I think how they make their work is very inspiring. And so I think we're in or hopefully we're in a moment where it's more obvious to those in production that pulling visual effects techniques into their work hopefully this is the point of no return, where you kind of have to do it and you can't ignore it anymore, or not even ignore it, but you have to be exposed to it. And I think that's exciting.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I run a school teaching people this all day long, so no, it's definitely a very familiar subject to me, and I've been lucky to work on some movies pioneering some of the techniques. The thing which I see a lot is the filmmakers are having to learn, well, not having to, but being invited to learn more about computer graphics, and the same in reverse, because people in visual effects didn't necessarily get much of an opportunity to go on set before. If you're the visual effects supervisor, or maybe on the CG supervisor, sometimes in general, visual effects people have been in a dark room somewhere, completely disconnected from the process, and not really able to understand cinematography, what makes a good shot, what is filmmaking, because there's your shot and you have to make that look good, but you don't get any choice around seeing how it was made or choosing to make it differently. So both sides, I feel like, are being drawn closer together, and I think we have so much to learn from each other in that respect, I think.
Yeah, no, 100%. I definitely agree with you there. So yeah, I mean, hopefully these conversations just like crack it all open.
Do you see more cinematographers wanting to, say, learn Unreal Engine to help their own process than individually, as well as them joining it in a production? Do you see people wanting to take it on as on themselves?
Yeah, I've seen a range of different, reactions to it. I think that some individuals are very excited because, maybe they want to take on more of the previs or the visualization, um, which is an interesting discussion. I mean, I guess even if you, depending on the scale of the project, that just is a different job description. It could totally bog you down. But yeah, that you have more agency maybe in visualization or understanding that process, so that when you are involved in those conversations, you feel like you can communicate more clearly with an artist or something. Um, I guess it's so funny because virtual production is so large. Um, I think there's a real rush from a cinematographer's perspective on the LED wall workflows, and understanding um, how to work with lighting and like a virtual gaffer in those spaces. And it's an interesting it's going to be an interesting ride to see kind of how it all plays out and whether virtual production influences hiring practices in physical production, because there's definitely an idealism around how we talk about it sometimes, where we're like, the DP will come on and then they'll hire a gaffer and they'll hire their crew. But in prep, they've spent this time working with the VAD team and the visualization team. And I see those relationships happening, and production is letting, a DP come on a little bit earlier to have those conversations. But I haven't seen productions pull on DPs quite early enough.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's interesting because every team is different, but sometimes the way that crewing works on the physical production side, it's not as stable as crewing on a visual effects team, right? Like if you're on a visual effects team, you pretty much have the job until the gig's over, for 6 months or 10 months or 2 years or however long you're working at that studio. But in production, people kind of change out a lot, and it's just a totally different way of working because everyone in that space is generally freelance, right? So sometimes you could have a gaffer start working with your VAD team and your visualization team, and they're genuinely on the project, but because they got a call from another UPM or DP or project that they absolutely need to take, now they've jumped from this away from your project to another project, and you have a new gaffer, or the same thing could, or in a similar sense, like, you could have some key people in the camera department really not be hired until the week before or the 2 weeks before the shoot because they are on another project that ends right before this project. So I think there's just a lot of logistics in how all these relationships will kind of, come together when producers kind of start understanding more about, how to line projects up so that the production crew can be more consistent in that prep process. I think some of those practices will probably need to be massaged a little bit as well. Because I think the ideal is possible. I just think that with some of the realities that we face in how things are organized right now, it's feeling pretty clunky.
Right. I guess it's still figuring itself out, still relatively new.
Yeah.
We have some questions that have come in from the audience, so let me go through a few of those. Somebody here's asking, what does the role of virtual production supervisor mean when it's client side?
That's a great question. So I would say typically, um, I would say you're the overall head of the department. So you're working with the director to understand their vision for what they'd like to achieve with any of the workflows that are considered virtual production on that project, and making sure that you've crewed the team, pull the right people together, whether it's individual artists or vendors. A lot of the time, if you have a client-side virtual production suite, the implication is that um, you would have multiple vendors or a core team with still subsequent vendors that you hired. Um, because similar, like for example, in visual effects, there are projects that require a client-side visual effects suite, and um, there's some that don't. Like there are certain directors who have great relationships with visual effects supervisors at a house, like DNEG or Pixamundo or Weta, fill in the blank, and they want to work with a supervisor that works at a company that has an established team, and then that supervisor could help manage workflows with other vendors. That's one way that that can work. Sort of same with virtual production supervision. And other times, the way that they like to structure the team is to just have a core client-side team, like a supervisor and producer, perhaps somebody else, an artist or two, or some coordination support on the client side, to help manage maybe multiple vendors or the large team that you have. Just depends how you set that up. But it's client facing. So that means that you're making sure that the director is happy and the production feels like you're staying on budget, and you're just taking care of that whole department and the logistics and clearing the path for everybody.
Got it. Yeah, so good. Can you have two virtual production supervisors, one on the vendor side and one on the client side, like you can with visual effects?
Yeah, totally. Definitely.
Cool.
Yeah.
And another question here. What's the biggest obstacle you faced in virtual production, and how did you overcome it? It sounds like an interview question.
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, they're all different types of problems on set, but here's kind of a fun one that we ran into this summer. I was on an episodic series, and we were shooting film. And so one of the challenges in protecting the color workflow was making sure that we had a digital reference camera on set with us for the duration of the time the film camera was there, just so that we could like check things and that sort of thing. But I guess where I was going with this was more like camera tracking. So the digital reference camera wasn't tracked, and it was kind of always there. But I bring that up because we had intended to shoot with a single, film camera and a single frustrum. That was the intention. That's how we planned everything. Those were the conversations kind of all the way up until the day of shooting. But we had scheduled some 2D work on the volume before the 3D work. And it sort of inspired the camera team and the director to bring 3 cameras to start when we shot the film. Because when you're shooting 2D, we weren't tracking it. It was relatively easy to do. So all that set up to say, we'd planned in advance and had a couple different Stipe camera tracking cams, like the camera pieces, so that we could have a few backups, one maybe on the digital reference camera and one on the film camera, and then a spare. So that was the logic for why we had 3 Stipe camera track systems. But the director and DP show up with 3 film cameras. And so one of the most challenging things to kind of think through on the fly with the team was like, and with the director was just like, okay, how would you like to work with us? And he's like, what can we do? and we're kind of learning a little bit in the moment as we're working with it. And so we thought, well, if you give us like 10, 15 minutes to set up each of our Stipe cameras on each of your film cameras, then you can say, I'd like the frustum to be on this camera. You'll only always have one frustum, but at least you can tell us which camera you'd like it to be, and that change will go over pretty quickly.
Right.
And so that was a tricky thing to kind of solve in the moment. And it, the complicated things around that are like, oh man, it's only at a 90-degree angle, but we need it to be at 45 degrees. Good thing we were experimenting in the background, and we had a fabricator, on set who was ready and had some pieces that they were just making. So it was challenging because a lot of the things that we were just anticipating and experimenting with and saying, well, what if they ask for this? And what if they ask for that? They usually did. And so it was kind of fun to be able to solve that problem, but challenging in the moment because you have the pressure of, everyone's spending like $2,000 a second
Yes.
on those projects. And you're like, how many seconds does it take to figure this out?
The patience graph,
Yeah.
it goes very quickly down and there's a cliff at the end. Yeah.
Yeah. Like that wasn't something that happened in like an hour. That was like a 5 to 10 minute blur of like figuring that out. So
Yeah, really interesting. So expect the unexpected.
yes.
Another question someone's asking, is there any gems you can offer about leadership, especially the different approach between the older and younger generations in visual effects?
Yeah, sure. I think that I'll speak from like an LED workflow perspective because I have some examples of how agile workflows, visual effect workflows, and union sort of production workflow kind of came together and had some friction.
I can imagine, yeah.
Yeah, it's totally bizarre. So I guess from like a leadership perspective, the teams that I've worked with, where we're bringing agile workflows to a set, mean that there's a lot more negotiating that I need to do in advance and kind of day to day to understand the time that our team needs to prep and work. And then I've done work where I've worked with our team and said like, these are kind of the rules that a union goes by, like expect this, expect somebody to say this, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of, I feel like trying to teach others through the best that you can, how to work with you and how to work with your team, setting boundaries that are clear for what you need, and just sticking to your guns and being honest about that. And then letting other people see you work. Like, I think people were really impressed by our team when they saw us, people in production. Like, I had a UPM that was helping us that had never worked in visual effects or in Agile. And when he saw our team throw up a whiteboard, and I ran a meeting where, everyone got to say, we were just trying to brainstorm, like, what are all the things that could come up? What are the things that we need to solve? And he saw the intensity and the participation of all the engineers and artists on the team contributing to that list. And then he saw everybody take ownership and say, well, put my name by that, put my name by that. We can fix that by this date. And then he saw us divide up that whiteboard, and we, in about 3 or 4 hours, had developed a plan for what we were going to do. And because it's agile, every day we would just update the whiteboard with things that we needed to do. People had never seen that way of working on a film set, because the film set is kind of the opposite. It's like, okay, team, like, your role.
This is what we're going to do.
Yeah, this is what we're going to do. Here's the gear list. Do it. Like, I shouldn't have to tell you twice. So, yep. So it was interesting for them to kind of see how film people work, and for anybody who was with us on set to kind of see how we worked. From a visual effects perspective, I really felt like I had to use a lot of visual effects producing skills to get us through the prep time and the visualization and the bad meetings, and to negotiate that with production and the director. It's like, imagine a team that has, it's like they forget what working with post visual effects is like. So you kind of have to say, we're going to have reviews, it's going to be on a schedule. And I know it's uncanny to have need a director's approval on things once or twice a week, but we're going to need that buy-in from the director and the production team to allow that in their schedule so that they can work with us and make sure that their creative vision is going to be on screen. And one nugget from set that I thought was really important was, it's been amazing to be a DP and to come in and have to work adjacent to a department, because, you know, I'm on a set thinking like, oh, I love camera, I'm part of camera, and to, you know, see the stone wall, like, we are camera, we don't talk to anybody who's not in our department, you know, it's like very interesting. So it was good to be able to understand the politics of a camera team and know that, you know, it's not always the DP that's running the department. They certainly are. They are the head, they are the boss of the team, but sometimes it's like a B camera operator or a first assistant camera that is helping hire the people that you see on set. And they're running the department, meaning they're doing all the prep work. They're making sure the right cameras are there. They're taking lists as the DP's talking about what they need with the director and making sure that that's kind of running and happening, and that every assistant has their marching orders. And so I think that's not very visible to most people, because you have to be mentored in the meritocracy of cinema to like have had that explained, you know, to you. But so some of the problems and the friction that I solve would be making sure that the person, whoever's running the department, knows that I'm a key leader on set, or if I have a technical supervisor that's doing like that volume supervision or something, that they know that that's a point person. And then I have to teach my point people how to talk to the other people. So there's a moment at the beginning of a shoot day for all meeting each other for the first time where I'm very involved, and I say like, okay, you need to meet this person and you guys are going to work together. And this is the person you talk to about wrangling cameras. And this person can't be slowed down. So even though it sounds like they're telling you what to do, they are, and you should do what they say. And I approve that. And so I think just knowing that you as a leader can smooth some friction out by giving approvals for like how things can operate or run and who talks to who, making sure that people know how to report an issue up to you. I've even had to train the camera department to know that whether they should come to me with an issue or come to somebody else on the team. You know, it's like, it's hard to put it all into one answer, but yeah, it's complicated.
No, it's great. Yeah, you've highlighted there as well how leadership is perceived generally as being top down, but leadership goes both ways. You have to have people from the floor leading up and telling the generals don't necessarily know what's going on. They need leadership to bubble up as well. And basically, in that sense, everybody in any environment is a leader and should feel that they're a leader. They may not get to make the decisions, but you're saying that leadership is everybody essentially.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, some pearls of wisdom there. Thank you.
Yeah.
And this so much of it is just interesting to me, how so much of this stuff, because movie sets are such a pressure cooker. They're so like dynamic, and like you said, then it's thousands of dollars a second in some instances. That there's a lot of pressure, or just a lot of need to make decisions quickly, and to leadership becomes almost I think one of the most important qualities in those environments. So it's a really important subject.
Well, and it's funny because this is making me think, I didn't answer the second half of a question from earlier about what, you know, a virtual production supervisor does. Like, you know, I think I answered the prep part of it, and you know, all that. But on set, you're up there with the director, with that core group of creatives, helping make decisions or having them tell you what they need of you and your team. And so on set, you know, you're running your team and making sure that they understand and are prepared for, you're setting the tone for how your team is going to function on set and how they're going to work with other team players. So that's another part of that head of department role as well.
Right. Yeah, you're a head of department. You're essentially a key creative in that sense. You're up there with animation supervisor, visual effects supervisor, DP, director. It's a key role. Yeah.
Yeah, and typically, I guess it depends on, you know, what type of virtual production you're working in, but you would always have, depending on what specialties, like your lead mocap or your lead facial capture person, you know, it's, you always have making sure that your leads are communicating with the right people. And sometimes that is the director, but I think also working with everyone to know what the timing is for that in certain contexts, whether it's like a prep session or on set, is really important.
Is there any way that how do you think, what would you advise people if they want to learn some of these kind of more soft skills or leadership skills? How do you get good at that? Is there a school, or you have to
The
just
time,
go get on a set and figure it out?
yeah. Well, I mean, it's like there's no one answer. I think it's going to be custom for everybody because everybody has a different passion and a different entry point into it. But when it comes to leadership, no matter what piece of this you're passionate about, um, it's really about putting yourself in that role. And I think that's the a big catch-22 of all of it, is like, you know, how do I do that? So my path has been working in independent projects in, you know, with filmmakers who give me that opportunity to have a leadership position, and then kind of building my resume and building my experience database that way. You know, there could be somebody else who like just has a connection that can put them in, you know, a bigger budget project faster, and that's how some people do it. But the basics of leadership are, it's kind of like building patience or any other discipline. Like, you just have to be patient, or to be a leader, you have to be able to put yourself in those roles, and then just reflect. Give yourself time to reflect about what worked, what didn't work. I think being open to real feedback is important, and it's harder to get. I'd say, like, as a leader, like that's where developing like self-awareness or putting people around you that can be really honest with you is super important. Because sometimes when you're in a leadership position, people don't want to tell you exactly how they feel because they feel like it's putting their job in jeopardy or something. But if you're able to get feedback that's good, honest feedback, like, hey, like, people weren't happy with how you handled this, you know, like even being able to find out that information can just help you on the next project or help mend relationships moving on to the next thing. Or, you know, like somebody goes, oh, well, you did that really well, or I felt so empowered when this happened. That's getting that feedback and then just practicing.
Right. Yeah, more experiential and yeah, being able to find there's not it's fairly new industry, so I guess finding mentors is a little more tricky than certain areas that have been around for longer. But I guess finding people that have been down the path before you and asking their advice, that good old school things like that.
Totally.
Somebody else is asking a question here saying, how do you track elements for virtual production?
Ooh, that's a great question. Well, you know, it's funny because it's like it's a little bit different for each slice, you're organizing motion capture a slightly different way than you would organize like other data, but it's all related because a lot of that data is so hinged on time code, and that in some chain lock components to time code.
Still shot driven.
Yeah, it's very shot driven, exactly. So it also kind of how you organize it kind of depends on at what point in the process you're collecting that data. But if you're on set, then it's scene, take, shot, like you were saying, and this is where like user experience, like things can get kind of pricey because, or they might not in the future because somebody will develop something for this. If you're probably on more of an independent set with a team of people that don't have tools that they've custom engineered for collecting metadata, you're probably doing it the traditional visual effects way, which is like coordinator by hand as best as possible.
Google Sheets.
Yeah, Google Sheets. Listen, we still use Google Sheets in some of the like more USD driven work, metadata collection workflows that I've worked with, but I've also had the benefit of working with teams that have put in enough tool development into like their own licensed piece of software that has taken a lot of the feedback of, from myself and, others on those projects for like what categories of data they need to send. And they've been able to aggregate that data from a reel, from the tracking, from the camera, and have that kind of all be pulled in to not only an Excel spreadsheet automatically, but organized in folder structure on a drive, so that the ideal thing is like when you're done with the shoot, maybe your production manager or coordinator is doing a couple hours or an hour of like cleanup work just to make sure that the computer caught everything and that we have a narrative for what happened with the data. But beyond that, it's pretty much ready to go right after the shoot. So that's like my favorite way of packaging data. And most studios don't really have that feature right now. Like that's something that you have to come in with or have figured out, which is why it's also nice to have a virtual production suite, because they can scope that out with the company that you're working with and figure out what's proprietary, or hey, I got a connection with somebody who has like a licensed piece of software for this that can help us. But yeah, it's totally important, but right now it's like a luxury user experience to be able to have automated data collected that way.
Right. Yeah, the sort of utopian ideal of having everything in shot grid, something like that. Like,
yeah, it's possible. I've seen it.
Right.
But,
yeah. It surprises me how many times it ends up in Google Sheets though on like a $300 million movie. Like we're doing it on pieces of paper, or like some of the Lion King, we had wallpapered an entire 50-foot wall with wallpaper that was made of whiteboard material, and everything was up there.
Oh yeah.
Not everything, obviously, but like a lot of it was run and in that way, which is super old school, but was just very practical and very, good to do it that way.
Yeah, well, you can have multiple people update a Google Sheet. It's great.
Yeah. It's got built-in functionality that works.
Yeah.
Got a couple more questions. So somebody asking, what aspects of virtual production did you use on Black Adam, if you're allowed to talk about it?
Yeah, sure. I can talk about it generally. So I would say they used a bunch of different types of techniques. I was excited because it was almost every technique that I'd ever wanted to see, like facial capture, motion capture. I got to run, over a month-long shoot, just collecting different actions from sequences. That was really cool. And we did some volume work. In Atlanta, we had a custom volume built that was pretty big. It's like a cylinder volume. And it was mostly used for interactive lighting. And I would say that the 3D, like real-time LED work that we did in Los Angeles at Island Studios, that was intended more as interactive lighting, hoping that we could get more final pixel out of those shots. And what was exciting also about working on that project was using Eyeline's LED human volumetric capture rig, which I don't know how many out there are familiar with, like photogrammetry and metastage and what Christina Heller's doing, but it was essentially the conceptually, the arrangement of cameras that a metastage would have, where you have really nice high resolution cameras kind of in a globe around a subject, but outside and built into the walls of this rig, instead of being a green screen rig, it was an LED screen, or like LED panel aid, essentially. And it also, it had, what do you call it, a treadmill inside, so you could get walking shots, and it had interactive DMX lighting around the ring. So I'd say that the majority of work that we did was intended for interactive lighting. And I still need to find out, if we had some final shots that slipped in. I highly doubt it, but the coolest thing was getting all of the lighting right. And the unusual thing about that project was that the pandemic gave them an extra 9 months to pre-visualize everything and do world building. So by the time we were shooting, it really was the final lighting in the CG world that we were going to use. So from that sense, it felt like a proper visual effects workflow that was totally, figured out. And I'd say that credit definitely goes to Bill Wessenhofer, who thought through all of that. I mean, the complexity of how he was thinking through all of those shots, from conception and visualization through his process in production into post, was pretty incredible. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Yeah, I'm a sort of part engineer, still can't help thinking about things in that way. So for me personally, definitely, it's always that side of things is really interesting. Just how things get made. It's also the making of books of what got me into the industry. Looking at the making of Jurassic Park and how they did what they did then, which was a breakthrough movie. But we're seeing more of those types of movies happen today, where new things are being figured out. When there is no precedent for a lot of this stuff. So it's really, really interesting to hear about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was cool to have, flying was 90% of that movie, right? Flying, and and we were lucky because he didn't have a full head of hair. So the cool thing that you could do inside of that rig, for any other cinematographers who have kind of played with this, if you have an array that's a ring, you can make it look like you're doing a camera move, because all the cameras are gen locked, and you can kind of switch, between cameras as you're going through the frames of film. So imagine having a globe and being able to kind of create a camera move at an extremely high resolution around a subject that's also perfectly captured, synced 3D data with photographic texture projection. And for anybody else who geeks out over that stuff, you're just kind of like, whoa, you're getting all of that information at once. Unfortunately, data processing on that scale and getting the, images, all the processed images, is always going to be a pretty expensive thing, which is why a feature like Black Adam would have to use that technique. But the fact that they can, and they did, was super cool.
Yeah, absolutely. It sort of dovetails a little bit with another question that we got, which might be our last one for today. Someone says on a recent DNEG presentation today, they talked about how they used volumetric capture very regularly. This person saying, could you speak to any volumetric capture workflows that you've used in film or TV?
Yeah, I mean, volumetric capture has been used for so long. It's almost one of those old school virtual production techniques that just is a visual effects technique, really, that just has a new life given to it, because companies like Epic Games, who've bought reality capture, and some of these softwares that drove the development of that art form, are more popular now. and they're more accessible like on a cell phone. But yeah, like volumetric capture data is used all the time, like all the time in features. It's perfect. It's like reference data for creating a digidouble. You can use it for de-aging a subject or aging a subject. Yeah, like environment work. It's used a ton of different ways. And it's hard to talk about it almost without like specific examples also. But like I thought Black Adam was a cool, like amazing use case for it because even I would say even 3 years ago, the engineering of the technology that I used on this show was just a what if. So kind of the holy grail in photogrammetry and volumetric capture from a visual effects standpoint is like how photoreal can you get? How many pores can you get? Like the holy grail is, can you capture subsurface in the skin? And like with the teams that I was working on at Gentle Giant, especially, we were talking about how far can you push infrared, cameras with volumetric capture. And like I was saying before with Black Adam, the more information that you can sync together using timecode in one capture, the better, like higher density, data that you have, and the more you can do with it. So sometimes volumetric capture data is just referenced. Sometimes it makes it in as like, a final texture projection. It's something that could turn into a 3D asset for a game engine build that you're making or a visual effects build. It could just be that you have artists making a 3D gray box of something and you need to have a 2.5D solution. And so you want to texture project, very realistic geometry or like images, textures basically on 3D geometry. And that's even a technique used right now in VR because the displays aren't that great. I guess maybe Meta came out with a competitive headset now, a month ago. But, in VR right now, it's a huge money saver and like millisecond like frame rate saver in a game engine. Being able to just have basic 3D geometry that's very low poly and having a 2D, very photorealistic, like projected image on it. Yeah. So just so many different use cases for it.
Very cool stuff. Yeah. I got okay, one quick other question which came in before we wrap. So someone says, as a VP supervisor, are you the head of the VAD or part of the VFX department?
Ooh. I am typically the head of my own department, which is virtual production supervisor. So it means that I could be overseeing VAD ultimately. Here's 2 ways I'll break it down. If I have built my own team that's just a group of artists, I would have a VAD lead or like a CG supervisor who's running my VAD department. But they're ultimately going to have sign off, like a quality sign off from myself, before we go into shooting. Or we're going to have sessions with a visual effects supervisor or production designer to weigh in on the quality, or a gaffer to weigh in the lighting. So I would say that they're just somebody that is a department head on my team. The same way like a head of visualization or visualization supervisor would be another department lead on my team. So I hope that makes sense. Like on a visual effects team, it's sort of similar where you have a CG supervisor. You could have a lighting supervisor, compositing supervisor, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it definitely does to me. I was VAD lead on Lion King, so I know exactly what you're talking about. Hopefully it does to the audience too. I'm sure that it does. Yeah, so we covered a lot of ground. Is there anything you're excited about? What are you excited about in the future of virtual production?
Ooh, well, I'm just very excited that about tools being more accessible and continuing to be. Um, and I'm also excited because there's so much interest in it. I mean, I think that, you know, having experienced the whole like VR kind of explosion and having it go away, mostly because they didn't have a platform to display it, kind of got stuck in itself. That was frustrating, but it's really cool that a lot of the same practices and principles are kind of living on through virtual production. Um, and that, both artists in production and artists in visual effects come together, work more closely, and have more interactive experience.
So yeah, it's important that I think this evolving as we use it more, it's forcing more people to try and make things better and workflows better, and the engineers out there to figure out solutions to problems and for people to care about it. And yeah, it's an exciting time, and I'm excited about it too. I also want to ask you if you have uh, anything you want to share, any links or places where people can follow you, or any of that kind of stuff.
Ooh, well, I definitely, if you'd like to stay in touch, LinkedIn is a great way to be in touch with me. I do have a personal website that just it mostly focuses on independent projects that I'm, working on, which is also searchable online, but it's kathrynbrillhart.com.
All right, we'll share that link as well. Are you still making your own films?
Yes, I am. I I had the ability to fly back from Atlanta while Black Adam was shooting, to finish shooting a short film that I had started working on in 2021, and that's currently in post. So hoping that, during this holiday season, there's a little bit more time to focus in on that before everything picks up again.
Does it involve virtual production?
Yes, this film, Camille, yes, it's a virtual production driven independent project. And, we made this, I had 14 weeks to write it and do all the prep, and then 2 days to shoot the project. So it's something that I've been, doing, kind of preparing presentations for, because I want to use the project as a way to share learnings with other filmmakers and, you know, like help trigger creative ideas, for those who think that they have limitations, even with a tiny volume or no budget.
Fantastic. Well, I'm excited. Maybe we could do something to highlight that when it's ready. Maybe we can do a little feature on it or something if you're up for
Oh,
that.
that'd be great. That would be awesome. I'd love that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I love big budget Hollywood stuff, but I also really care about independent filmmaking, and that we've had some people go through the school who've made a student project that's gone on. Was one person recently, Byron Chow, who made a project through the class, which is 8 weeks long, and then used that as a pitch to do a Kickstarter. He then raised enough money. It was about 25K, so a pretty small budget in filmmaking terms, but he made a virtual production movie and did it in an LED volume, a small one, an affordable one. But actually, it's really cool to see how independent filmmaking has access to this too, because I think everybody just thinks of the Mandalorian and it's like that's not me because I don't have that much money. But yeah, I'd love to highlight your work from that side of things as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. And there are other techniques to talk about too in that space that, you know, depending on your relationship with visual effects as an independent filmmaker, could be viable as well, like using in-cam camera system, or you know, like the Moses in-camera tracking system that, does live compositing with green screen. So yeah, there are tons of different ways to get these techniques onto your project.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to another session sometime. We can talk about that as well. Um, but yeah, Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I appreciate your time.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me.
You bet. Of course. Thank you also to all our listeners today. Thanks for tuning in and asking great questions. This has been episode 36 with Kathryn Brillhart, and in another couple of weeks, we'll be back with another great guest. If you enjoyed what you heard, you can follow us at becomecgpro.com. If you're interested in any of the courses that we do, you can find out more information there. But yeah, thank you to Kathryn and to everybody for today's great podcast. See you all soon.